All right, so our first speaker is Pastor Maracle, President and Chief of the Native American Fellowship of the Assemblies of God. And I will very quickly turn it over to you, Pastor Maracle. Thank you for joining us.
Yawa. Saya gom skanago okatsununi tiwakwego tegukwago. Sakoneseriiosta ne yunyats. I said, great peace to you. I'm so happy that all of us could get together. And they call me Sakoneseriiosta, which means he makes the day good for them. And that's an important name because I'm the only one that holds it among our culture. I'm coming to you from the Mohawk territory, and it's an honor to be invited and honored to be able to present to you. I think that I don't know about anybody else, but I feel like I got the hardest assignment on this symposium, talking about Native spirituality. It's a big term designed to encompass a lot of complexity. Many people, this might be a review for many, but I think that it's important to understand that there are 622 Native nations in North America, and all of those nations, they may have different languages, they have different cultural backgrounds, a way of doing things, they have different ways of acknowledging relationships. And inside of that, the spirituality aspect can be a wide variety of practices and activities that make connection. I say all that to say this, that the term Native spirituality is really a misnomer, because there's no such thing as Native, due to the fact that Native would make somebody believe that there was only a singular, when there's actually over 622 different nations. So 573 of them are federally recognized, but it goes toward the aspect of a lack maybe of desire to understand that there's really no such thing as Native spirituality. It's like when I've talked to others, that it's really natives, plural, spiritualities, plural, due to the fact that there's a great range of relationship to spiritual things among Indian country. There are monotheists, there are pantheists, there are deists, there's all the ists that you can name anywhere around the world. You also find as in among the American Indian nations in North America. Of course, that when I say American Indian, I'll also be including Alaska Natives. And so the spirituality aspect is something that gets complex very quickly, and it usually throws everybody off. Recently, I was walking onto an airplane coming back from visiting an elder who's a Mandan, who found himself living down in Atlanta. I was down there to talk to him about a very interesting spiritual encounter that he had. But I'll put that to the side to say this: as I was walking onto the plane, I had a woman behind me that saw a tag on my carry-on, and it said Native American Fellowship. And she asked me what Native American Fellowship is, and I told her that it's a fellowship of Native American churches within the Assemblies of God. We have 190 churches on 104 American Indian territories, Alaska Native villages, and urban centers. And she quickly started speaking to me. She was non-Indian. She started speaking to me with some authority, telling me how she loved Native American culture, and was always interested when she went to a powwow and saw the natives practicing their culture. And I let her speak for a moment, and then I politely corrected her, saying just what I told you: there's 622, and we don't have one single culture, and that's a common misconception. She quickly ended conversation with me, because what I found is that the notion of dealing with 622 different nations is overwhelming to people who have come to learn about the romanticized Native American that they read in history books and on television. Native spirituality is a very difficult concept, but nonetheless, it's an important concept because it has to do with the way Native nations and the people that make up those nations interact. It has very much, it has a lot to do with the relationship. And that's usually where Native spirituality ends, because it's an automatic notion of a connection to the earth and Mother Earth and a natural relationship with the world around, which is partly true, but it's not always wholly true. Native spirituality, like I said, spans, and we often like to focus on the notion of that oneness with the earth, and again, that's partly true. With Native spirituality, though, a lot of it has to do with the particular people. And that's where the health equity comes in, because the listening aspect, to understand the nuances of how that particular nation relates to the spiritual realm and how that interacts and informs their relationship with one another, relationship with the natural environment around them, becomes very important. I'm not I have to say that I can only give you what I've been given in my listening to elders around me, and that's a very important. It's important for us to understand that what we see as Native spirituality today is a large part of manufacturing that is very common in the Western world, to make things up, to manufacture. Tommy Orange, in his book, there opens it up with his concept of indigeneity, growing up in Oakland, California, and rather than describing the natural order of things, he describes everything around him that is manufactured in one way or another: buildings, parking lots, roadways, cars, technology. He goes through his incredible kind of monologue of what it is to be indigenous growing up in Oakland. And he points out a great problem, a great challenge. He points out the fact that many natives have grown up without the straight connection to their culture and their language, to their own people. And they've kind of been forced to represent Native America in many respects. And because of pride, things get made up. As I've gone through through Indian country, especially with my own people, my own elders, I've come to realize that there's a great frustration in Indian country among the older people who still speak their language. They grew up in their traditional ways, and they don't have the platforms. So that's one of the reasons why I'm incredibly thankful for this opportunity. Because when I've spoken to elders in preparation for this particular presentation, regardless of whether they're Navajo or they're Mohawk, regardless of whether they're Tlingit or Yupik or Inupiaq, or the very incredible number of elders that have poured into me, one thing that is common among their voices is that to point out their differences, and to point out that they do have different ways of relating to the world around them, and that the language is really a major portion of their particular people's spirituality, because it has to do with their relationship to the natural order. In the Mohawk, we have the Ohandu Galiwa Dekwa, which is the words that come before all matters. And in our way, we acknowledge we're a monotheistic type people, and we acknowledge creator of all things, Sungguan Dizo. And in that acknowledgement, we go through the relationships. We go through relationships to the people. We go through relationships and acknowledging the obedience of all creation to all of the to everything that the creator of all things had put in place. We give relationship to the earth, and we do this by speaking not to the creation itself, but speaking through the creation to show respect for the relationship that we have that was given to us by Sungguan Dizo. Other people would call him God, and or the Lord, the creator of all things, the heavens and the earth. And that's an important understanding of relationship. It all begins with the language. Well, with the residential schools and with various government policies, the languages there was an attempt to destroy the languages, and those famous words, save the man, kill the Indian, start to influence what we know as Native spirituality because of those gaps with the language, but with this romanticized notion of being one with the earth. Natives are put into a kind of a vice in that they need to know their language so that they could really understand the spiritual nature of the things that are around them. You know, in the address that I just spoke to, we even addressed the medicine herbs, and that translating into English, it's now we turn to all the medicine herbs of the world. From the beginning, they were instructed to take away sickness. They were always waiting and ready to heal us. And we're happy there are still among us those special few who remember how to use these plants for healing. With one mind, we send greetings and thanks to the medicines and to the keepers of the medicine. And in that moment, you begin to understand, even though it is in English, you begin to understand the realities of the relationship, that we acknowledge this creation or the natural element of the herbs, but we acknowledge it and for its job, but we also acknowledge one another for keeping the knowledge of how to use these herbs for medicine. Generally, when we take a look at Native nations, they're incredibly practical, and yet they still acknowledge this gap of not knowing. Questions are very important as we work among Native spirituality, because proper questions are important to get proper answers. I know that seems like it's obvious, but it's oftentimes, as we're pointing out in this symposium, it's not always obvious. The things that we would otherwise take for granted are not always applied to American Indians and their cultures and their spiritualities. But to understand those spiritualities on an individual basis, then we begin to give rise to a lot of knowledge that is untapped by asking right questions. There's a lot of question about Christianity and its interaction with Native spirituality. And I don't have all the answers to that, but what I can say is that as I've looked at history and I've talked to different elders, both people who claim to have a relationship with Jesus Christ and those who don't, are both of whom are very traditional. I'm struck by the similarities when we get past the religiosity of the Christian church or Christendom and the way it was presented. I was fortunate to be brought up among elders who are traditional in the way of life, using language, using stories, and at the same time having a desire to have a deeper connection to the things around, being nature, being one another. And that's where native spirituality starts to really take root. I can give you more particulars from my context because I can't speak for the Navajo, I can't speak for the Sioux, I can't speak for the Tlingit or the Yupik, but I can speak because I've had the honor to have permission to speak about these things as a Mohawk. And the Mohawks have what's called the Ohandu Kaliwa Tekwa, which is our words that come before all matters. We also have the Gayanagoa, which is the Great Long Way. It's been often translated as the Great Law, but again, there's a shortcoming in understanding of language because in our language, Ganyangeha, we don't have that word in there for law. There's no law in there, but it's Yoyanali, which means the way, and then Gayanaragoa, it's to say the Great Long Way, so that we can see ahead of time, so we can look down the road to make sure that as we make decisions, we're affecting not only ourselves and those who are immediately around us, but we're also affecting the generations. And that's, as I've been told by my elders, where the 7th generation thinking comes, because we're not just thinking about our own immediate grandchildren, we're thinking also about those that are unborn and the value of life. And in that sense, that's where the spirituality comes in, because the spirituality is the beyond your physical, it's the metaphysical, and even those things that are to come outside of our physical presence, even if it is to become physical down the road, it's still beyond us. And so that's where spirituality among the Mohawks begins, with ourselves and with our own mind. We have a common saying that we have a good mind. The Ohandu Galiwa Dekwa even starts off with that. And it's important to have a singular mind, to have a good mind, and to be able to think on our own and be able to ask these questions. But there's always this nagging question beyond the physical. And so we begin to turn to spiritual things, the things that are beyond our physical. And as we do that, we begin to look at the relationships. We start off with the relationships of observing the way the creation obeys and does what it's supposed to do. But we also acknowledge that that there are still bad things that happen in the world, and we begin to ask questions about those negative things. You know, the wind is great when it feels good on your face, but then all of a sudden, when it starts blowing you over and blowing over your houses or blowing over your crops or your fields, and you know, we start to ask these questions: what's going on? Again, it starts we start to ask about those relationships and how they tie together. Christianity was in the early days presented as a relationship. It wasn't so much presented as a religion, but instead those who brought Christianity over had a genuine interest. Even on the territory that I'm on right now, and I live in Akwesasne, though I do pastor in Lexington, Massachusetts, I go back and forth so as to fulfill my full obligations as a human and as a Mohawk. Even in Akwesasne, the sharing of Christianity was not presented so much as a religion, but it was a relationship. And it's this relationship that was caught on and adopted early among even the Ganyangehaga, which is the Mohawk, and many of the Haudenosaunee, which are the people of Long Coast, or other people call us the Iroquois. We're early adopters because we're always looking for this relationship to everything around us, and we always knew that there was something deeper. And so when the presentation of Jesus was brought to us, it wasn't brought to us as a religion, but instead of a relationship, that we could have a direct relationship with the God, the creator of the heavens and the earth, and we would become family. Well, the word family is a tight word in Mohawk, because it means we're bound together, we're brought together. And that relationship in our language was a very powerful relationship. What we see in the history of Christianity and Native spirituality is that relationship then grew. And as I was thinking, I was talking to some of the elders. They said it was kind of like the story of Cain and Abel, in the sense that there was a jealousy, because as Mohawks, we were looking for this relationship, and we understood it very well because it clicked. The creator of the heavens and the earth wanted a relationship directly with us, and that we could shed all of our sin, all of our shame and our guilt, because we all knew that we had done something that was going to be displeasing to him, which is one of the reasons why we consistently addressed him each day as we started up the day with Ohandu Kaliwadekwa. And so that direct relationship began to flourish. And there's a very real sharing aspect to our culture, that we bring people in, and we bring them in as family, and we share. And there was a problem with this, because while we were growing in this relationship and getting excited, it meant that those who came after, who no longer wanted to share a relationship in Jesus, but rather wanted to utilize a religion in order to bring control, and didn't want to share in our language. The early people shared in our language. We have Bibles translated from Greek and Hebrew into Ganyangeha, which are examples not from the English, but direct translation. The translations and those words began to take root into our hearts. But then, because those who were more looking for God to be their power base, they ruined that relationship. And so we see the onslaught of Christendom, which is the forcible action of bringing the church to bear as a power, and ruining the relationship. And so we see people in the next generations going away from Christianity, because it was more of a forced religion rather than the relationship that had been earlier adopted and shared. Some of this relationship is expressed through the scriptures. Lisa Brooks, former professor at Harvard and now at Ithaca College, wrote a great book about how those early relationships were part of were a part of an important project on preserving many woodland cultures through the scriptures and through the writings of those early ministers who really adopted deeper relationships with the people that they were among. They would learn the language, they would learn the cultural ways, and they would even become, in the Mohawk culture, the Gayanagoa gives us the ability to adopt people into our clans and and give them a name. Earlier, I told you that my name is Sakoneseriiosta. He makes the day good for them. And that reminds me of my role that I was taught by my elders. It means he makes the day good for them. It doesn't mean that you make the day good for yourself. It doesn't mean that you make the day good for him or her individually, but instead we refer to you as he makes the day good for them. And that's a role, that's a responsibility to bring goodness into people's lives, because we live in a fallen world, and plenty of people feel that fallenness and that the negatives. And so your role is to make the day good for them together. And in that, people are able to be adopted, though, and they're given a name and those responsibilities in that name. And only one person's technically allowed to have a name at a time, because you're fully responsible for your name. This goes back into spirituality, because being fully responsible for your name, I was taught that your name is the one thing that can be on the hearts and the minds of other people. Again, going back to that relationship among the Ganyangehaga. It's not always the same among the other nations, but when you begin to look at one particular, you begin to identify the differences in others. And then the value of those differences and the deep measures have been brought through the language and when we talk about relationships. So I was told that my name is my responsibility because it's on the hearts and the minds. It's the one immortal thing that you can have even while you're alive, because it can be where you are not, and it can be everywhere that is spoken or thought of. And that goes to relationship. So in that, I have responsibility to make sure that my name is good. It's not a slur, like one would say, oh, they call him in a sarcastic tone. They call him, he makes the day good for them. But everybody knows in their mind that he doesn't. You see, there's a deep relationship, and goes beyond that spirit. So it goes into that spirituality in a sense of a metaphysical connection and relationship that is very practical. It's very practical. It's not the goosebumps or the vision pieces, which are all important, but I really don't have enough time to go into that deeply. I guess to wrap up, because I'm coming up on my time. Native spirituality is a misnomer. It's been something that has actually harmed American Indian nations more than, I would argue, more than Christianity, because it finds its roots in the gap, the manufacturing from people who are perhaps too prideful to just be honest, that they never received their language, they never received the stories. So they've been forced to scramble and pull and begin to bring this pan-Indianness to fore in their spirituality. So they'll pick a little bit from the Sioux, they'll pick a little bit from the Mohawk, they'll pick a little bit from the Navajo. And that's just not native. It's native in label, but it's not in the root of the spirituality, because each of the spiritualities come from the particular people and their language. Particularly, the language is really a major portion of, if we're going to lump it all together, native spirituality. Language is very important to the particulars of native spirituality, and that's one of the ways that Christianity is able to be interwoven, because in each of those languages, oftentimes there's relationship connection that's beyond the physical, and there's a desire for a deeper relationship beyond the physical. And when it was presented for that relationship, and it was focused, or those that brought Christianity were focused on the actual word of God, which is called the Bible. We see that. We see people who actually knew the word. We can see our languages, because our languages tie into the word. Even in Genesis chapter 10 or 11, when God confused their languages, he created all the languages and he dispersed them in his sovereign power around the world. And so we see that connection point into the languages, and then even reinforcing after Christ's death and resurrection, the gift of tongues was present in the Word of God, that they were able to bring the things of God in their own languages, the languages that they weren't learned by those people. And these people, those who had gathered in Jerusalem at that point, even though they knew different languages, they heard these Galileans speaking in the languages of their people, telling them about the things of God. I started off my presentation talking to you about a woman who I had to politely correct with her lumping together of native spirituality, native culture as a singular, and pointed out that we're different and we're cultures, 622 different nations. I spoke to you about this man Mandan, who found himself living in Atlanta. He's close to 100 years old. He's 93 years old. And when I brought him up for a reason, and it goes back to this language, it goes back to relationship and direct relationship with the creator of all things. Because back in 1914, a group of people who were messengers of Jesus Christ, they had been at Azusa Street in Los Angeles, California. And they felt a strong prompting of God and to go up into North Dakota. And they found themselves in North Dakota, and the Mandan people had not had a whole lot of interaction with English. So many of them didn't speak English, but these people who were prompted and convinced and compelled to go up in North Dakota to minister on the behalf of Jesus Christ, they were able to go up, and in the common way that we saw in the record of Acts, these men had began to speak in the Mandan language and started speaking to the Mandan people about the things of God, and the Mandan people all received a relationship with Jesus because of the presentation. It was presented as a relationship. It was presented in their own language and was easily relatable. And this man, Melvin Clout, he was a direct result of that particular interaction of relationship in the language. That the scripture says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and the Word, nothing that wasn't created, but it wasn't created by and by through Him, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Word, the language was readily received, and relationship through that language was regularly received, and marks really the beginning of Native spirituality. If it's going to be in a singular, it really is found in the depths of the language particular, and the way that those relationships are formed through that language and identified. So I hope that this is helpful to you, and I appreciate the opportunity to present, and really excited about any kinds of questions that you might have.
I'm not familiar with this chat feature on this particular form of Zoom. I don't know if there's any questions. I do have an introductory question, and we want to move this quickly because I know we're running into the next block. I love the fact that you brought up Lisa Brooks, who used to be at Harvard, who basically would probably make an argument that Christianity, the Christian community, helped to surround indigenous community, Native community, and support it in certain ways. It reminds me of a funny story. Michelle Hicks, former chair of the Eastern Band of Cherokee, I was at a meeting of Methodists, and he had, in years, maybe that same year, he had testified in front of Congress saying that Lumbee people are not Native, and they don't know who they are and don't recognize them, right, as federally recognized Indians. But at the same time, that week he was supposed to be at a meeting which was primarily Lumbee people in the Methodist Church to fellowship, to be Christians together, to plan, humanitarian missionary trips to different communities, to be Christians together, to worship together. And I believe that kind of epitomizes a lot of what you're saying here, is that there's a sense that we privilege the political and the scene, what is sort of in our everyday kind of lives, before we allow a really in-depth conversation about what, in a metaphysical, spiritual world, connects Native people, especially within the context of the Christian church, which is partially what I study. I know, you're invested in the conversation too. But our people, the Pope recently gave the apology to, the people of Canada, Indigenous people of Canada. And, there's a lot of criticism from Native communities about, what does Christianity mean to us? What does the church mean to us? Which, we would probably say that the Catholic Church is different than the Protestant church. And then there's all these different distinctions. in Christian religion. But how do you reflect on that a bit?
Mhm.
If you can just go in just a couple minutes.
Right. Yeah.
This is a powerful conversation that we're having, and like how do we begin to normalize a conversation that doesn't pit the church or religion more generally against Native people?
Yeah. So I think that the it starts with knowing what the Bible actually says. And then what's ironic is that the first book printed on a printing press in North America was printed at Harvard in the basement of the Indian school, and it was the Bible in the Wampanoag language. And the Wampanoags had almost lost their language entirely, but the word of God kind of became a seed of old words, because they were the words that weren't even spoken anymore. And it was a proper translation, and so they were able to recultivate their language using the Bible. And it's not really. I might be stepping on some toes, but it's not really for the Pope to give an apology for Christianity as a whole. And here's the reason why. He doesn't represent the entirety of Christianity. He represents the Roman Catholic Church. And there are other parts of the family of God, so to speak. But at the same time, it would have been better for him to show what God says directly from the scriptures about the activities of those who use his name in vain. The Bible is a relationship document. And that's one of the reasons why I believe Mohawks and other Native people were early adopters, because they were relationship oriented. That the Word of God says that those who use my name in vain will not be exonerated. There's a relationship there, and there's a very legal thing there. Exoneration is a big deal in the legal realm. If you use my name in vain, that means if you take advantage of my relationship for your own power and your own purpose, then I will not exonerate you, right? And so there's a relationship there, and a threat of broken relationship. And the Word of God doesn't change. God's not a man unless he changes his mind. His word will remain the same. And so that gives that relationship understanding can go toward God, who is a righteous judge, will make that decision on those people that look to destroy languages that God created. God didn't try to destroy languages. In fact, he created them, and it's documented in Genesis. It's documented in history with the Bible. So there's a relationship aspects here in the scriptures, that when Native people were shown the relationship words in their entirety, and not surrounded by religiosity and power structures, but a relationship of family, that's why the Cain and Abel, because Abel was presenting offerings that were pleasing to God, and Cain was just getting by. And in order to become number one, he had to murder his son, right? There's a broken relationship there. And so we see this interaction that's very real and still continues today, because Natives have a real deep desire for a relationship.
And it reminds me of conversations you and I have had. We often picture the Boston Tea Party as white people in America pouring out British tea, right? We often forget that they were masquerading as American Indians. Right. And I often tell people, use this as a framework. There were people coming into the United States as colonizers who were, dressed as Christians, or they were dressed as holy, or they were dressed as people who could redeem Native people, but they were in a costume. It was fake. And so that doesn't speak to the realness or the authenticity of the relationships that can happen in these and the Christian context, let's say.
So it would have been more proper for the Pope, and that's the way that I presented to people. God is a righteous judge, and he will take care of that. But the question is, we complain about not listening to our elders, not knowing our language, and that are we willing to, and I present this to people, even using the Wampanoag, the translation of the Bible. are you willing to take a look at the most ancient of elders, the one who created the language, and for such a time as this saw that it would need to be recultivated as a seed, and it would be a healing to the heart and the mind.
Yeah.
That relationship is very real, but unfortunately, many people have experienced Christendom rather than the Christ who wants and desires relationship.
Well, Pastor Maracle, we have to hurry up. Nicole's
Thank
giving
you.
the ocean. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And yes, you've set off the day correct in the right way. Thank you so much.